July 1929, Barrow-in-Furness, England. The rhythmic percussion of pneumatic riveters at the Vickers Armstrong shipyard defined the mechanical birth of the HMS Perseus. This was not merely the assembly of another hull for the Royal Navy, but the construction of a Parthian-class long-range ocean-going submarine, a machine designed to resolve the strategic problem of distance. At 290 feet in length and displacing over 2,000 tons when submerged, the Perseus represented the pinnacle of interwar British unders engineering. She was a vessel of the P-class, a series of boats built with a singular doctrine in mind: high endurance, high autonomy patrols in the vast and unforgiving expanses of the Far East. The engineering intent behind the Parthian class was a direct response to the strategic requirements of the British Admiralty during the late 1920s. Planners required a platform that could navigate the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, operating for weeks at a time far from established repair tenders or friendly ports. To achieve this level of self-sufficiency, the Perseus was designed with a massive internal fuel capacity and a riveted pressure hull optimized for a test depth of 300 feet. While later wartime designs would transition to all-welded construction to provide greater rigidity under shock, the Perseus was a masterclass in 19th century craftsmanship applied to 20th century tactical requirements. Every steel plate of her hull was joined by multiple rows of precision-driven rivets, a labor-intensive process that relied on the mechanical friction and clamping force of the fasteners to maintain watertight integrity against the weight of the ocean. To understand the structural stakes of this design, one must analyze the concept of the hydrostatic pressure differential. In naval architecture, the pressure hull is the primary sanctuary for the crew and the mechanical heart of the ship. At the surface, the air inside the submarine is at 1 atmosphere of pressure, equal to the outside environment. However, as the vessel submerses, the ocean exerts an increasing force on every square inch of the hull. For every 33 feet of depth, the pressure increases by approximately 1 atmosphere. At her test depth of 300 feet, the Perseus was subjected to approximately 9 atmospheres of external pressure, or over 130 pounds per square inch. The engineering problem was to ensure that the internal atmospheric pocket remained constant and breathable, while the external steel skin sustained thousands of tons of inward pushing force. A single failure in a rivet line or a hairline fracture in a C-valve would result in a high-velocity water jet capable of cutting through biological tissue and steel alike, followed by an instantaneous collapse of the structural boundaries. The internal metabolism of the Perseus was powered by a dual propulsion system consisting of 2 Admiralty 8-cylinder diesel engines for surface transit and 2 massive electric motors for submerged operations. This configuration was the defining constraint of early 20th century submarine engineering. The diesels provided 3,600 shaft horsepower, allowing the ship to maintain a surface speed of 17 knots while simultaneously charging the massive banks of lead-acid batteries. These batteries were the finite reservoir of the ship's underwater life. When submerged, the Perseus was limited to approximately 9 knots, a speed at which the internal resistance of the motors and the depletion rate of the battery chemistry dictated the tactical endurance envelope. The engineering crew functioned as a collective of specialists managing these energy states, ensuring that the transition from oxygen-breathing combustion to the silent discharge of the electric motors was executed with mechanical precision. Perhaps the most forward-thinking engineering feature of the Perseus was the inclusion of the Davis Submerged Escape Apparatus, commonly known as the DSEA. This was not an afterthought, but an integrated safety system that recognized the extreme risks of deep water operations. The DSEA was an early form of oxygen rebreather, consisting of a rubber breathing bag, a canister of soda lime, and a small cylinder of high-pressure oxygen. The engineering logic was elegant but rigorous. The wearer would breathe into a closed-loop system where the soda lime canister functioned as a chemical scrubber, removing carbon dioxide from the exhaled breath through a chemical reaction that converted the gas into calcium carbonate and water. The oxygen cylinder would then replenish the mixture, allowing a sailor to survive for approximately 30 minutes during an underwater escape. However, the rebreather was only one half of the survival equation. To facilitate an exit from a sunken hull, the Perseus was equipped with specialized escape trunks located at the forward and aft ends of the ship. These trunks were vertical steel cylinders designed to act as mechanical airlocks. The engineering intent was to allow a small group of men to enter the trunk, seal the lower hatch to isolate themselves from the rest of the ship, and then intentionally flood the space with seawater. This flooding was necessary to achieve pressure equalization. At a depth of 170 feet, the weight of the ocean creates a force of nearly 80 pounds per square inch on the external hatch. It is humanly impossible to push a hatch open against that weight. Only by raising the internal pressure of the escape trunk until it matches the external sea pressure can the mechanical latch be turned and the hatch opened. Without the DSEA and these escape trunks, any hull failure beyond shallow water was considered an absolute death sentence by the Admiralty. The strategic role of the Perseus shifted as the geopolitical climate darkened in 1940. Though she was engineered for the long reaches of the Pacific, the immediate requirements of the Mediterranean theater diverted her to the first submarine flotilla based in Alexandria, Egypt. This was a radical change in her operational environment. Instead of the deep blue water plains of the Far East, she was now operating in the confined narrows of the Mediterranean, a region defined by shallow continental shelves, high visibility water, and the constant threat of defensive minefields. The high-endurance capability of the Parthian class was now being utilized for high-intensity interdiction strikes, where her 300-foot depth rating was often the only margin of safety she possessed. The hull geometry of the ship also featured prominent external saddle tanks. These tanks held the primary fuel and ballast water, wrapped around the internal pressure hull like a protective sleeve. This configuration allowed for a greater internal volume for the crew and machinery, while providing a layer of soft protection against minor impacts. However, it also increased the surface area of the ship exposed to the corrosive effects of salt water and the kinetic energy of the sea. Maintenance of these saddle tanks and their associated piping was a constant requirement for the engineering department, as any breach in the fuel-ballast interface would compromise the vessel's displacement and its ability to maintain neutral buoyancy at depth. Every component of the Perseus, from the massive brass propellers to the smallest indicator gauge in the control room, was a testament to the Vickers-Armstrong engineering philosophy. They built ships to last, assuming a life cycle of decades under the most strenuous conditions. The rivets were driven with the expectation that they would never move, and the pressure hull was tested to ensure it would never yield under the standard loads of deep water patrol. But the architects of the 1920s could not foresee the specific evolution of underwater weaponry. They had engineered the ship to survive the hydrostatic pressure of the deep, but they had not accounted for a threat that attacked the hull with the concentrated kinetic energy of a seismic event. A hull engineered to withstand the weight of 300 feet of water is a sanctuary until that equilibrium is shattered by an external force that directs pressure from the inside out with explosive violence. The ship was ready, the crew was trained in the technical discipline of the Royal Navy, and the survival systems were locked in their racks. The Perseus was a functioning strategic instrument, a machine of high tensile steel and calculated buoyancy, moving toward a coordinate where the laws of naval architecture would soon be tested by the absolute physics of rapid displacement. The engineers in Barrow and Furness believed they had built a vessel that could endure anything the ocean could provide. They were right, but the ocean was about to become the silent guardian of the ship's final engineering secrets for over half a century. The year 1941 redefined the Mediterranean from a maritime thoroughfare into a high-intensity laboratory of tactical attrition. For the Royal Navy's first submarine flotilla, the strategic objective was absolute: the total severance of the supply lines sustaining the Axis campaign in North Africa. HMS Perseus, operating out of the naval base at Alexandria and later the besieged fortress of Malta, was a primary instrument of this doctrine. Under the command of Edward Christian Frederick Nicolay, the submarine was tasked with a series of missions that pushed the mechanical limits of her Parthian-class design. Operating in the Mediterranean Narrows presented a mathematical impossibility for a long-range vessel of her scale. She was a 290-foot machine designed for the vast depths of the Pacific, now forced to navigate a constricted battle space where the seafloor was often shallower than her own length. Commander Nicolay's tactical execution relied on a cold understanding of the ship's displacement and her acoustic signature. In the clear, high-visibility waters of the Ionian Sea, a submarine is not truly invisible. Even submerged, the silhouette of a vessel as large as the Perseus could be detected from the air by Axis reconnaissance aircraft. To counter this, the engineering crew had to master the delicate science of buoyancy control, maintaining a depth that balanced the risk of visual detection with the structural limits of the hull. The 300-foot test depth of the riveted pressure hull, which we have previously analyzed for its hydrostatic limits, was no longer a theoretical specification. It was the submarine's only sanctuary. During these patrols, every descent to depth was a calculated trade-off between the safety of the dark water column and the increasing load on the thousands of Vickers-Armstrong rivets. The operational record of the Perseus during this period was a study in precise kinetic delivery. In September 1941, the submarine intercepted the Italian tanker Maya off the coast of Cyrenaica. This engagement was not a matter of luck, but of tactical geometry. Nicolay had to position the Perseus within a narrow firing solution, calculating the lead angle, the target speed, and the variable currents of the Mediterranean. The launch of her torpedoes required a sudden shift in the vessel's internal weight distribution. As the heavy steel projectiles were ejected from the tubes, the trim of the submarine was momentarily compromised. The diving officers had to respond with industrial speed, venting or flooding ballast tanks to prevent the bow from broaching the surface and revealing their position to the escorts. The sinking of the Maya was a successful demonstration of this mechanical coordination, a victory for the ship's integrated combat systems. Shortly after the strike on the Maya, the Perseus achieved another strategic success with the destruction of the merchant vessel Fiume. These strikes were critical because they denied the Axis forces the fuel and materiel required for their desert offensives. However, each success increased the risk profile of the submarine. The Italian Navy responded with the deployment of sophisticated anti-submarine measures, including hydrophone-equipped escorts and the expansion of defensive minefields. For the crew of the Perseus, life on patrol was a continuous cycle of managing the mechanical metabolism of the ship. The Admiralty diesels were pushed to their thermal limits during surface transit, charging the massive banks of lead-acid batteries that would provide the silent energy for the next submerged engagement. Inside the cramped compartments, the discipline of the engineering team was the vessel's true power-to-weight multiplier. Every valve turn and every battery cell reading was performed under the shadow of the environmental constraints of the Mediterranean. The heat in the engine room often exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the mechanical rhythm never faltered. The Davis Submerged Escape Apparatus, or DSEA rebreathers, remained stowed in their racks, a constant reminder of the survival gear readiness that was the standard for all Royal Navy boats. The crew operated with the technical confidence of men who believed in the structural integrity of their face machine. They understood that their survival was a function of their ability to avoid the unseen hazards of the seabed while maintaining the kinetic initiative. The resilience of the Parthian-class design was revealed under these real conditions. Despite the heat and the constant pressure cycles, the Perseus remained a high-functioning combat instrument. Her long-range autonomy, originally intended for the Far East, allowed her to remain on station for extended periods, providing persistent surveillance of the Axis supply corridors. This endurance was a strategic advantage that few Mediterranean-class submarines could match. However, the Mediterranean was not the Far East. The density of Axis traffic and the proximity of coastal air bases meant that the Perseus was always operating within the primary defensive envelope of the enemy. Commander Nicolay had to navigate not just the water column, but the political and strategic requirements of the Malta Command, which frequently demanded high-risk penetrations of the Ionian Sea. The mechanical performance of the ship during these months was a testament to the Barrow and Furness construction. The rivets held firm through repeated depth charge attacks and the thermal stress of rapid surface transits. The engineering department developed a systematic approach to hull maintenance, identifying and patching the effects of galvanic corrosion before they could compromise the pressure hull. This proactive technical judgment ensured that the Perseus was always ready for the next mission. The submarine was no longer just a mechanical system. It was a proven weapon of war, an instrument that had effectively altered the calculus of the supply war in North Africa. By early December 1941, the Perseus departed Malta for her final assigned sector off the Greek island of Kefalonia. This patrol was designated as a high-priority interdiction mission. Strategic intelligence indicated a surge in Axis supply movements through the Ionian Sea, and the Perseus was the best-positioned asset to disrupt them. The submarine moved through the darkness, her low-surface silhouette and 300-foot depth rating the only variables protecting her from the sensors of the enemy. The machine was at its peak operational readiness, its weapon systems locked, and its survival gear stowed in a state of absolute preparation. The success in the Mediterranean had been a function of avoiding the unseen, but the ocean floor off Kefalonia was already being mapped by the enemy with explosive precision. As the Perseus crossed the thermal gradients of the Ionian Sea, the tactical geometry of the patrol was reaching its terminal phase. The engineering logic that had guided her through the strikes on the Maya and the Fiume was about to be tested by a structural challenge for which there was no repair manual. The ship was a functioning combat instrument, a veteran of the Alexandria flotilla, moving toward a coordinate where the laws of naval architecture would soon be superseded by the physics of rapid displacement. The mission was on schedule, the systems were functional, but the Mediterranean narrows were closing in on the Perseus with the weight of the entire Axis defense. The performance of the submarine versus her design intent had been exemplary. She had proven that a long-range Pacific hull could be adapted for the high-intensity coastal warfare of the Mediterranean. She had functioned as a balanced system of buoyancy, power, and kinetic energy. But in the engineering of naval warfare, the greatest successes often lead to the most extreme risks. The Perseus had survived every engagement because her crew maintained the technical integrity of her riveted skin and her internal machinery. As she entered the waters off Kefalonia, she was a ship at the height of her power. Yet she was operating in an environment where a single oversight in the detection of the seafloor would render her design intent irrelevant. The record was clear. The Perseus was a successful machine, a strategic asset that had won every battle it was designed to fight. The question was whether that record would be enough to survive an environment that no longer followed the rules of engagement. December 6th, 1941, 23:30 hours. The Ionian Sea off the coast of Kefalonia exists in a state of thermal and acoustic silence. HMS Perseus was transiting on the surface, her Admiralty diesel engines providing the steady mechanical pulse required for her patrol mission. To an observer on the bridge, the ocean appeared as a dark, uniform plain. But the reality beneath the keel was a dense landscape of industrial hazards. The submarine was navigating through the Emma minefield, an Italian defensive installation designed with mathematical precision to deny the Royal Navy access to the supply corridors of the Mediterranean. The transition from a functioning combat instrument to a shattered hull was not a gradual failure, but a high-velocity event initiated by the physics of the Hertz-Horn trigger. The logical paradox of naval mine warfare is the relationship between a minute chemical reaction and the destruction of an 1,800-ton machine. The Italian Emma-class mine utilized a sensing mechanism known as the Hertz-Horn. These are the characteristic lead protrusions seen on the surface of a naval mine. To understand the Hertz-Horn mine physics, one must analyze the sequence of energy transfer that bypasses the armor and structural integrity of the ship. Each horn is a lead sleeve containing a glass vial filled with a potassium bichromate electrolyte. Beneath the vial is a simple battery cell consisting of carbon and zinc plates. But without an electrolyte, the cell is inert and the circuit is open. When the hull of the Perseus made contact with the mine, the lead horn was crushed, shattering the internal glass vial. The electrolyte was instantly released into the battery cell, generating a sudden surge of electrical current. This current traveled to an electric detonator, which triggered a booster charge, finally initiating the primary explosive payload of 330 pounds of high explosive. The entire sequence, from mechanical contact to a high-velocity chemical expansion, occurred in less than 100 milliseconds. The Perseus was not defeated by a strategic error or a failure of the crew, but by the instantaneous activation of an acid-driven battery that triggered a localized seismic event against the forward starboard hull. The detonation occurred specifically in the vicinity of the forward battery compartment. The explosive force created a localized pressure wave that far exceeded the ductility limits of the high-tensile steel plating. The rivet lines, which we have previously analyzed for their role in the ship's 300-foot depth rating, were subjected to a sudden shear force that the Barrow and Furness engineers had never intended them to sustain. Thousands of Vickers Armstrong rivets were essentially fired like bullets from their holes as the plating buckled inward. The integrity of the forward pressure hull was compromised instantly, creating a massive breach that allowed millions of foot-pounds of energy and thousands of tons of seawater to enter the ship. The immediate result was a catastrophic failure of longitudinal stability. In naval architecture, a submarine relies on a delicate balance between its center of gravity and its center of buoyancy. The massive influx of water into the forward section shifted the center of gravity toward the bow with violent speed. The Perseus did not settle into the water. She performed a ballistic plunge. The bow dipped at a steep angle, lifting the stern and the twin propeller shafts into the night air. The diesel engines, suddenly deprived of cooling water and subjected to the thermal shock of the explosion, stalled and were rapidly submerged. The submarine was no longer a vessel. It was a 1,800-ton weight entering a free-fall trajectory toward the seafloor. Inside the forward compartments, the situation was a terminal engineering crisis. The flooding of the battery compartment introduced salt water to the lead-acid cells, triggering a rapid chemical reaction that produced high concentrations of chlorine gas. This gas, denser than air, filled the lower levels of the boat, attacking the respiratory systems of the crew and rendering damage control efforts impossible. For the 60 men on board, the structural failure of the hull was compounded by a total chemical failure of the internal atmosphere. As the ship descended, the internal bulkheads, designed only to resist minor internal flooding, were forced to sustain the full hydrostatic load of the Mediterranean water column. This descent was governed by the laws of Boyle's law, which dictates that the volume of an air pocket is inversely proportional to the pressure. As the Perseus plummeted, any remaining air inside the unflooded aft compartments was compressed with terrifying speed. At the surface, the air was at 1 atmosphere, but as the ship crossed the 100-foot marker, the air was squeezed into less than half its original volume. The pressure inside the hull began to rise as the water column pushed in through the forward breach. This atmospheric compression created a physical environment where the human body was being subjected to the same hydrostatic forces as the steel frames. The sanctuary of the riveted hull had become a high-pressure trap where the internal and external pressures were attempting to reach a violent equilibrium. The trajectory of the sinking was a bow-down plunge that lasted less than 60 seconds. The Perseus hit the sandy bottom off Kefalonia at a depth of 170 feet. The kinetic energy of the impact warped the remaining intact frames and settled the boat upright on the sea floor. The forward section, which had absorbed the primary mine strike, was a ruin of twisted steel and exposed internal machinery. The 60 men who went down with the hull were now part of a static record of a failure sequence that had begun with the crushing of a single lead horn. The ship was down. Her internal systems were shattered, and saving the vessel became an engineering impossibility due to the total flooding of her primary buoyancy volumes. The strategic consequences of the loss were immediate and profound. The first submarine flotilla had lost one of its most capable long-range assets during a critical phase of the Mediterranean supply war. The interdiction of Axis convoys was weakened, and the Admiralty was forced to reallocate remaining boats to cover the gap left by the Perseus. Forensically, the loss was treated as an absolute finality. The depth of 170 feet, while within the ship's test depth, was considered a graveyard because the violence of the Hertz horn strike suggested no possibility of internal survival. The Royal Navy struck the Perseus from the operational register, assuming that the machine and its 60 men had been entirely reclaimed by the sea. The sinking of the Perseus was not just the end of a combat mission. It was the creation of a forensic mystery that would remain buried for 56 years. The ship lay in the darkness of the Ionian Sea, her hull a monument to the lethality of Italian mine technology. The engineering logic of the era dictated that the failure of the forward pressure hull and the subsequent plunge to the seafloor were irreversible events. The ocean had claimed the last gun cruiser of the Alexandria flotilla, and the silence that followed the sinking was accepted as the final chapter of the ship's history. No one in the Admiralty believed that a machine shattered by a Hertz trigger could leave behind a human signal that would eventually rewrite the rules of maritime survival. 5 miles off the coast of the Greek island of Kefalonia, the Ionian Sea preserves a mechanical secret that the Royal Navy officially classified as a physiological impossibility for over 5 decades. Following the disappearance of HMS Perseus in December 1941, the operational file on the vessel was closed with a cold, technical conclusion. There was no mathematical probability of survival for any individual trapped within a hull shattered by a Hertz-horn mine at such depths. However, the emergence of a man named John Capes on the Greek shore several days later created a forensic paradox that challenged every established model of work. Maritime survival and salvage analysis. Capes was not a member of the primary crew, but a stoker traveling as a passenger, a technical outlier whose testimony was met with institutional skepticism that lasted for 56 years. The problem of finding the wreck of the Perseus was not merely a matter of geographic coordinates. It was a struggle between human testimony and the absolute laws of physics. According to the report provided by Capes, he had been in the aft compartments when the mine struck. He claimed to have gathered 3 other survivors, entered the aft escape trunk, and waited for the internal pressure to equalize with the external ocean before opening the hatch and ascending 170 feet to the surface. From the engineering perspective of 1941, this narrative was riddled with technical anomalies. At a depth of over 50 meters, the partial pressure of oxygen and the onset of nitrogen narcosis should have rendered a man incapable of performing the complex mechanical sequence required to operate the Davis submerged escape apparatus. The Royal Navy doubted his story, suggesting instead that he must have been on the bridge during the strike, or that his memory was a byproduct of psychological trauma. This skepticism created a 56-year gap where the location of the ship remained an unsolved navigational blur. The navigational uncertainty off Kefalonia was the primary oceanographic constraint preventing the localization of the hull. The channel between Kefalonia and Zakynthos is a complex corridor of shifting currents and variable seafloor topography. On the night the Perseus was lost, the specific current vectors and the drift rate of surface debris were not recorded due to the clandestine nature of the mission. When independent shipwreck hunters began to take interest in the Perseus in the late 20th century, they were forced to contend with a search box of enormous proportions. Traditional side-scan sonar methods were often defeated by the acoustic noise of the Ionian seabed, where limestone outcrops and underwater ridges could create sonar shadows that mimicked the silhouette of a Parthian-class submarine. The search was further complicated by the forensic location of the Italian Emma minefield. While Axis records provided a general grid for the defensive installation, the mines were not stationary objects. Tethered to the seafloor by cables, these explosive spheres were subject to the kinetic energy of 50 years of storms and underwater seismic activity. Locating the specific breach that had claimed the Perseus was like searching for a single fractured rivet on a mile-long steel plate. Without the physical evidence of the hull, the story of John Capes was categorized as a naval myth, an engineering impossibility that lacked a verifiable anchor on the sea floor. For oceanographers, the challenge lay in the discrepancy between the ship's last reported position and its actual resting place. The Perseus was a 290-foot machine with significant residual momentum at the time of the mine strike. The plunge to the seabed was likely not a vertical drop, but a ballistic trajectory influenced by jammed diving planes and the asymmetric thrust of the propeller shafts in the final seconds of power. This meant that the wreck could be miles away from the initial point of contact with the Hertz trigger. The failure of conventional search methods for 5 decades was a result of relying on official loss coordinates that did not account for the complex hydrodynamics of a sinking Parthian-class hull. The skepticism of the Admiralty was rooted in the physiological math of the water column. To survive an ascent from 170 feet, a human being must manage the expansion of air within their lungs according to Boyle's law, while resisting the debilitating effects of high-pressure gases in the bloodstream. The Royal Navy's medical experts argued that the cold, the depth, and the 5-mile swim to the coast of Kefalonia represented a combination of factors that no human could survive. This technical dismissal meant that no official resources were ever allocated to find the ship. The Perseus remained a phantom of the archives, its location a secondary concern to the perceived impossibility of the stoker's escape. However, the Capes myth was exactly what eventually focused the search. Investigators realized that if Capes had indeed survived, he must have left behind a mechanical signature that could not be erased by 50 years of currents. An open escape hatch, an empty DSEA canister, or the presence of specific personal artifacts in the engine room would provide the forensic proof required to vindicate his story. To find the Perseus, searchers had to accept a paradoxical premise, that the human signal was more accurate than the Admiralty's mathematical models. The search transitioned from a routine shipwreck hunt into a forensic audit of the limits of human engineering and biological endurance. By the mid-1990s, the arrival of digital GPS and high-resolution sonar arrays began to narrow the margins of error. Maritime archaeologists in Greece started analyzing the reports of snagged nets from local fishermen, a type of ground truth data that official naval surveys often ignored. Each torn net at a specific coordinate represented a potential man-made obstruction on an otherwise flat, sandy bottom. The convergence of these snag points began to trace a silhouette approximately 290 feet long, resting in a sector that the Admiralty had previously overlooked. The wreck was not where the math of 1941 said it should be. It was where the logic of a drifting, dying hull predicted it would settle. The problem of finding the Perseus was ultimately a problem of time and technology. The 56-year gap was a testament to the difficulty of reconciling archival data with the oceanographic reality of the Ionian Sea. The localization of the ship in 1997 would not just be an achievement of sonar mapping, but the start of a deep-water autopsy. Searchers needed to see the aft escape hatch to know if the stoker had spoken the truth, or if the world was right to call him a liar. The silence of the seabed was about to be broken by the lights of a new generation of divers, and the answer to the paradox of John Capes was waiting in the darkness of the engine room, 5 miles from the shore and 170 feet down. In 1997, the waters northwest of the island of Kefalonia yielded an acoustic signature that transformed a 56-year-old mystery into a cold engineering reality. This was the moment of detection, where a specialized search team led by Kostas Thoktorides identified a massive, man-made anomaly resting on the seafloor at a depth of 170 feet. This discovery presented a logical paradox. A vessel that had been officially erased by the Royal Navy as an absolute graveyard was now appearing on sonar screens as a remarkably intact structural entity. To an elite marine surveyor, the localization of the hull was not the conclusion of the mission, but the start of a rigorous forensic mapping project. The ship was no longer a phantom of the archives. It was a 1,800-ton mechanical system that required a systematic assessment to determine if the secrets of its interior could be safely extracted using the diving technology of the late 20th century. The detection phase utilized high-frequency side-scan sonar arrays to cut through the oceanographic noise of the Ionian seabed. The searchers were looking for a hard return, that matched the specific dimensions of a Parthian-class submarine, 290 feet in length and approximately 28 feet in beam. When the sonar shadow finally emerged from the digital data, it revealed a hull that had achieved a state of stable equilibrium. The HMS Perseus was not lying on its side or scattered across a wide debris field. She was sitting upright on the sandy floor, her keel buried slightly in the sediment, as if she were still in a dry dock. This upright orientation provided a critical mechanical advantage for the assessment team, as it meant the external hatches, the periscope shears, and the escape trunks were accessible for inspection, without the need for complex structural shoring or hazardous excavation. The engineering feasibility analysis for a forensic survey at 52 meters depth is a matter of strict atmospheric math. At 170 feet, the ambient pressure is approximately 6 atmospheres, or 88 pounds per square inch. This depth exists at the extreme edge of conventional air diving limits, where the risks of nitrogen narcosis and the requirements for lengthy decompression cycles dictate the pace of work. To assess the hull, the divers had to function as forensic engineers, navigating an environment where the water was clear, but the currents were unpredictable and could reach several knots. The mission was not to salvage the steel, but to salvage the truth. Every decision-making process was focused on a single technical objective: verifying the status of the aft escape trunk to resolve the skepticism that had surrounded the ship's loss since 1941. Mapping the wreck revealed a startling contrast in structural integrity. The survey team focused their cameras first on the forward section, where the hull showed evidence of a catastrophic failure. The steel plating in this area was distorted and folded inward, creating a jagged landscape of exposed internal frames and shattered battery cells. However, as the cameras moved toward the midships and the stern, the forensic state of the ship changed. The aft section of the pressure hull appeared almost entirely intact, a testament to the Vickers-Armstrong construction and the reliability of the riveted seams. This integrity suggested that the internal voids of the engine room and the aft compartments were likely still sealed off from the forward flooding, creating a pressurized vault that had remained undisturbed for over half a century. The core of the salvage decision involved the mechanical assessment of the aft escape hatch. In naval engineering, the status of an escape hatch is the definitive indicator of whether a submerged extraction was attempted or completed. To understand the stakes of this inspection, one must analyze the physics of pressure equalization. Inside a sunken submarine, the crew is trapped at 1 atmosphere of internal pressure, while the ocean outside exerts hundreds of pounds of force per square inch. An escape hatch is designed as a pressure-seated seal. The more water above it, the more tightly it is held shut by the weight of the water column. To open such a hatch from the inside, the pressure in the escape trunk must be raised until it is exactly equal to the external sea pressure. This is a process of intentional flooding and atmospheric compression. If the survey team found the hatch open, it would serve as technical proof that a human being had successfully mastered the math of equalization under terminal conditions. The search team faced a critical decision. Should they attempt a physical entry into the hull or limit the survey to external observation? The engineering risks were significant. The interior of the Perseus was a high-threat environment containing tangled cables, silt-clogged passages, and the potential for unexploded ordnance. Furthermore, the ship was a designated war grave, which imposed strict legal and ethical constraints on any activity that might disturb the remains of the 60 men inside. The technical verdict was to prioritize external forensic mapping and the inspection of the escape trunk over invasive internal recovery. By utilizing high-resolution cameras and divers trained in deep-sea wreck assessment, the team could verify the ship's mechanical status without violating the sanctity of the grave. This was a decision that defined the outcome of the 1997 survey. choosing forensic accuracy over the logistical complexity and risk of a full-scale salvage lift. As the divers descended to the 170-foot marker, they began a systematic audit of the ship's external controls. They noted the position of the diving planes and the status of the periscope shears, which provided a record of the final configuration of the ship during its descent. The hull was covered in a thin patina of marine growth, but the rivets and the seams remained sharp, allowing the engineers to count the frames and confirm the vessel's identity beyond any statistical doubt. The sonar shadows that had first detected the ship were now being replaced by a three-dimensional map of a machine that had survived 56 years of deep-sea immersion without a total structural collapse. The engineering team was operating with the knowledge that any sudden movement of the silt or a change in the internal pressure balance of the wreck could lead to a localized collapse, making the mapping a high-stakes industrial procedure. The assessment of the aft escape trunk was the climax of the feasibility study. The divers moved along the dorsal deck of the submarine, their lights illuminating the circular hatch that served as the ship's final sanctuary. In the silence of the Ionian Deep, the mechanical state of this hatch was the only variable that mattered. If it was locked from the outside, the Admiralty's skepticism would be validated, and John Capes would be remembered as a man of trauma and fabrication. If it was open, the world would be forced to reassess its understanding of physiological limits and the capabilities of 19th-20 survival engineering. The survey team was not looking for treasure or naval secrets. They were looking for a single mechanical truth that was held in place by 52 meters of water. Competing recovery options, such as using a remote-controlled cutting tool to enter the hull or attempting to refloat segments of the ship using airbags, were discussed, but ultimately rejected as unnecessary. The ship was a strategic monument, and its value lay in its preservation and the forensic data it contained. The engineering logic was to treat the wreck as a static laboratory, a site where the history of 1941 could be read in the steel without further destruction. The decision to proceed with a forensic-only survey was a rejection of the industrial salvage mindset in favor of a specialized archaeological approach. The ship would remain on the seabed, but its identity and the mechanism of its survival would be brought to the surface through the lens of a camera and the testimony of the divers. The survey of 1997 was a masterclass in site assessment under depth and environmental constraints. The team had successfully localized the HMS Perseus, mapped its structural remains, and evaluated the risks of deep water investigation. They were standing on the threshold of a technical revelation that would bridge the gap between the archives and the abyss. The upright hull, the intact aft section, and the pressurized escape trunk were the components of a forensic puzzle that had waited over half a century for an answer. The final results of this assessment were about to provide the technical justification for a story that the world had long considered an engineering impossibility. The ocean had guarded the ship's secrets with pressure and darkness, but the technical judgment of the search team had finally found a way to read the record written in the steel of the engine room. The survey of 1997 reached its technical climax when the remotely operated cameras and the divers converged on the aft section of the hull of the HMS Perseus. In the absolute stillness of the Ionian Deep, the lights of the research team illuminated a single piece of mechanical evidence that resolved the longest-standing mystery in British naval history. The aft escape hatch was open. This was not a failure of the seal or a result of structural decay, but a deliberate and locked mechanical state. The hatch was fixed in its fully extended position, providing the ultimate technical justification for a story the world had spent 56 years labeling as a physiological lie. The ship remained a silent resident of the sea floor, but its status was salvaged from the realm of myth into the realm of forensic truth. to understand how a single man could bridge the gap between a shattered hull and the surface 5 miles away, one must analyze the physics of the human extraction. When John Capes pushed himself out of that hatch and began his journey from 170 feet, he was subject to the absolute laws of Boyle's law. This fundamental principle of physics states that the volume of a gas is inversely proportional to its pressure. In a deep sea environment, this relationship dictates the survival or destruction of the human lung. As a man rises through the water column, the ambient hydrostatic pressure decreases, and the air trapped within his lungs and the Davis submerged escape apparatus bag begins to expand at a geometric rate. At the seabed depth of 170 feet, the air in the human lung is compressed to approximately 1/6 of its original atmospheric volume. As Capes moved toward the surface, this air sought to regain its natural size. For a survivor, the engineering requirement of the body is to act as a continuous relief valve. If a sailor holds his breath during an ascent from this depth, the expanding air will rupture the delicate alveoli of the lungs, forcing gas bubbles into the pulmonary capillaries and then into the bloodstream, causing a terminal embolism. Capes survived because he maintained the technical discipline to exhale continuously during his 3-minute journey, essentially turning his own vocal cords into a high-pressure regulator. This was the buoyant ascent technique, a physiological maneuver that the Royal Navy of 1941 considered beyond the capability of an untrained stoker. Yet the open hatch proved it had been executed with mechanical precision. The forensic survey inside the aft compartment provided further mechanical confirmation of the struggle. Divers identified several discarded DSEA rebreather canisters, their chemical soda lime contents spent, and their high-pressure oxygen cylinders empty. These were the biological lungs that had sustained the 4 men who initially entered the escape trunk. While the other 3 survivors were unable to complete the grueling 5-mile swim to the coast of Kefalonia, the presence of the empty canisters in the engine room proved that the extraction process had been executed exactly as Capes had described in his official report. The most humanizing forensic detail was the discovery of a small glass bottle of rum, found near the escape station. Capes had noted in his testimony that he had taken a drink to steady his nerves and ease the crushing pain in his ears during the pressure equalization phase. Finding that bottle 56 years later was the ultimate human signal in an industrial graveyard. The technical justification for the non-recovery of the hull was absolute following the 1997 survey. The assessment confirmed that the HMS Perseus was no longer a viable candidate for a traditional salvage lift. The forward strike from the Hertzhorn mine had resulted in a catastrophic structural divorce between the battery compartment and the bow. The thousands of Vickers-Armstrong rivets, which we have previously analyzed for their role in the ship's 300-foot depth rating, had reached their elastic limit and failed across a massive segment of the starboard hull. The ship was no longer a pressure vessel, but a perforated steel girder, filled with thousands of tons of sediment and the remains of the crew. To attempt a lift using pontoons or external buoyancy would have likely resulted in the hull snapping at the point of maximum torsion, a risk that far outweighed any historical or material value the ship could provide. Furthermore, the site was officially designated as a permanent war grave under the joint jurisdiction of the Royal Navy and the Greek government. This legal status protects the Perseus from the aggressive cutting and dredging that has erased other naval wrecks in the Mediterranean. The ship remains on the seabed as a strategic monument, a place where the mechanical decay of the steel is secondary to the preservation of the engineering record. The coordinates are marked not as a site for industrial salvage, but as a coordinate of remembrance where the ocean keeps the ship in a state of absolute compression and honor. The upright hull remains a landmark of the Ionian Sea, a testament to the durability of 1920s design. The long-term engineering lessons of the Perseus escape led to a fundamental reassessment of submarine survival doctrine throughout the 20th century. The Royal Navy's technical schools began to incorporate the data from the Cape's escape into their training protocols, acknowledging that a buoyant ascent from depths exceeding 50 meters was indeed possible if the technical sequence of equalization was mastered. The Davis submerged escape apparatus was refined based on the failure points noted in the canisters, and the design of escape trunks in future classes was modified to provide faster flooding and more intuitive mechanical control handles. The failure of the ship in 1941 resulted in the survival of submariners for decades to come, as the limits of the human lung were recalibrated based on the physical evidence found off Kefalonia. Strategic analysis of the Mediterranean campaign confirms that the Perseus was an instrument of immense tactical value right up until her loss. She had successfully disrupted the fuel supply for the Desert War, and her presence in the Ionian Sea had forced the Axis to divert resources to defensive mine warfare. Her refusal to be forgotten is a testament to the resilience of the men who operated her. The ship did not die a simple death. It lived on as a forensic ghost that eventually returned to claim its place in the historical record. The 56-year gap between the loss and the discovery allowed for the technology of the 1990s to finally catch up with the mystery of 1941. As the Perseus continues her residence on the sandy floor, the salt water continues its electrochemical work on the riveted seams, and the grenadier fish navigate the silent corridors of the engine room. The open aft hatch remains as a permanent mechanical testament to the day that a stoker proved the Admiralty's mathematical models wrong. John Capes was officially vindicated in 1997, receiving the recognition that had been denied to him for over half a century. He was the only hardware ever recovered from the ship, a living piece of engineering memory that carried the secret of the escape until the world was technologically ready to see the truth. The HMS Perseus is a masterclass in the logic of survival. It is a system that functioned at the highest level until it met a Hertz trigger, a system that failed with violent speed, and a system whose single survivor utilized correct technical judgment to bridge the gap between 5 atmospheres and the open sky. The wreck is the ending of the ship's patrol, but the open hatch is the beginning of our understanding of what the human body and mind can endure under the most extreme mechanical constraints. The ocean keeps the secrets of the ship in silence, but the forensic evidence of 1997 has ensured that the history of the Perseus is written in truth rather than skepticism. The ship is gone, but the data is salvaged. The HMS Perseus remains 170 feet down, a silent sentinel of the Ionian Sea, representing the point where naval architecture meets the absolute physics of the deep. The legacy of the ship is not in the steel that remains, but in the lessons learned from its failure and the impossible breath that allowed a stoker to swim home 5 miles through the darkness. The engineering of the past has been validated by the technology of the future, leaving the Perseus as a permanent monument to the resilience of the Royal Navy. The record is now complete, the hatch is open, and the silence of the abyss remains the only witness to a machine that refused to stay lost.